The first time I noticed her, I didn't even realize it was the start of something that would quietly consume my attention. I was carrying a stack of mail down the hallway when I saw her, unpacking a box in front of her apartment door, her movements deliberate, graceful, almost like she was performing a dance I hadn't been invited to watch. She looked up for a brief moment, and our eyes met. For a split second, I was caught off guard by her presence. A woman in her early 40s with a calm confidence that seemed to fill the narrow corridor. Her laugh, soft and genuine, echoed lightly against the walls, and I found myself smiling at the sound even though I was supposed to be on my way. She had this subtle way of moving that drew attention without demanding it. The tilt of her head as she examined a box label, the gentle brush of her fingers over the cardboard as if coaxing it to reveal its contents. I remember noticing the warmth of the sunlight hitting the hallway and casting a soft glow over her hair, making it shine like it carried its own light. When I passed her on my way back upstairs, she shifted slightly to let me through. Our arms brushed. Nothing dramatic, just the lightest touch. Yet I felt a small jolt of awareness, as though my body had recognized a new rhythm it hadn't encountered before. She gave me a small, playful smile, almost apologetic, almost teasing. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, but something subtler, more magnetic, a quiet acknowledgement that she noticed me noticing her. I caught myself lingering near her door longer than necessary. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself observing the little details. The way her scarf fell casually over her shoulder, the faint scent of vanilla, and something earthy that lingered around her. The confident way she carried herself even amid the chaos of moving boxes. There was a quiet strength to her that contrasted sharply with the awkwardness I felt in my own skin. As I turned to leave, she called out, her voice gentle but carrying that subtle edge of teasing I didn't yet understand. "Careful, boy, don't trip over my boxes." My heart did a small flip, and I nodded, unsure of whether I was responding to the words or the way she said them. That night, I replayed the hallway in my mind. Every movement, every glance, every brush of her hand seemed magnified, lodged in memory in a way that felt important even though I didn't fully understand why. She had a way of being present that made ordinary moments feel charged with possibility. Even though we hadn't spoken much, in fact, hardly at all, I felt a curious pull toward her, a mixture of admiration, wonder, and something I wasn't ready to name yet. And in that quiet hallway, as the light faded and the world moved on around us, I realized with a strange, nervous excitement that this might just be the beginning of something neither of us could have anticipated. A connection that promised to unsettle the careful rhythms of my life in the most unexpected, yet quietly thrilling ways. It wasn't long before the hallway moments turned into repeated, almost accidental encounters. The first was in the laundry room. I had just opened the machine when I realized she was there, folding clothes with a quiet efficiency that somehow made the mundane chore seem graceful. Her hair fell lightly across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear with a casual flick of her fingers that I couldn't stop noticing. "Need a hand with that?" I asked, gesturing toward the heavy laundry basket she had balanced precariously. Her eyes lifted, and she studied me for a moment, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I think I've got it," she said softly, but her tone wasn't dismissive. It was almost playful, like she was weighing whether to let me help. I stepped closer, and as I reached for the basket, our fingers brushed. Just a brief touch, but it sent an odd, warm flutter through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted slightly so we were side by side, moving in tandem to place the basket on the folding table. The elevator encounters were no different. We'd step in almost simultaneously, sometimes pressed together by coincidence, sometimes by necessity. She had this quiet rhythm that made even these small, cramped spaces feel intimate. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, something soft, floral with a hint of something warm and grounding. It lingered even after she stepped out. The faint brush of her shoulder against mine was enough to make my pulse quicken, my mind suddenly aware of the closeness in a way it hadn't been before. Her voice became a melody I didn't realize I was memorizing. She spoke lightly, asking about mundane things, the weather, the laundry, a missing detergent cap. But there was a warmth in it, a personal rhythm, that made each word feel more important than it should have. I found myself wanting to linger longer than necessary, making excuses to step into the laundry room, to press the elevator button one more time, just so I could ride with her. And then, there were the playful little comments she made that seemed designed just for me, though she delivered them with a casual air, as if they could mean anything or nothing at all. "Careful, boy almost knocked over my laundry basket," she teased once, and I laughed nervously, not just at the words but the soft way her gaze lingered on me afterward. There was curiosity there, and maybe amusement, and something else I couldn't quite name, something magnetic that made the air between us feel heavier, warmer. By the end of that week, the hallway and shared spaces of the building had become charged with anticipation. Each accidental encounter carried its own tension, subtle but undeniable. I caught myself imagining conversations, rehearsing words I might never need, and lingering just a moment too long whenever she smiled in passing. It wasn't just attraction. It was a fascination with the way she moved through the world, confident yet unguarded, poised yet quietly playful. Each small, accidental touch, each lingering glance, built a quiet rhythm between us, a rhythm I hadn't expected but now couldn't stop noticing. And I realized, somewhere deep in the back of my mind, that this was only the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to ignore. It started innocuously enough, a request for help. I was carrying a bag of groceries up the hallway when she opened her door and smiled, holding a small, wobbly shelf. "Hey, could you give me a hand with this? It's heavier than I expected," she said, her voice calm, but with that faint edge of playfulness that always caught me off guard. Inside her apartment, everything felt both familiar and foreign. There was a lived-in warmth, stacks of books in one corner, a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen counter, sunlight spilling through sheer curtains. I set the groceries down, glancing around, trying to appear casual even though my heart was hammering in ways that made me self-conscious. We lifted the shelf together, our hands brushing more than once. Each time, the contact felt electric in its quiet, ordinary way. A brush of fingers along the wood, a slight adjustment of posture, and the subtle weight of her presence pressing gently against me. It wasn't flirty, exactly, but it was intimate in a way that made it impossible to ignore. As we worked, conversation flowed easily. She shared small details about her divorce, not with bitterness, but with a sort of quiet reflection, the kind that made her vulnerability feel raw yet dignified. I found myself sharing my own recent struggles, my voice lower than usual, more honest than I intended. It was strange, a casual Saturday morning chore turning into a conversation that revealed more than I thought I could say to someone I barely knew. There was laughter, too. Subtle, warm laughter that filled the room, soft enough to make the mundane act of lifting a shelf feel like an adventure. At one point, I leaned over to adjust the shelf just as she did, and our shoulders touched. I felt the faintest brush of her hair against my arm, and a quiet warmth spread through me. She looked up, eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, words weren't necessary. The air itself seemed charged with a new, unspoken understanding. After the shelf was secure, she stepped back, her hand resting lightly on the edge, and smiled. "Thanks," she said, her eyes lingering on me just a fraction longer than usual. "I could probably manage on my own, but it's nicer with company." Her voice was casual, but the weight behind the words made my chest tighten. We lingered in the kitchen with coffee she insisted on making for me. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of her perfume, a comforting, slightly floral scent that seemed to wrap around the room and around me. We talked about everything and nothing. Favorite books, music, mundane errands, and small dreams we hadn't dared share with anyone else. By the time I left, the sunlight had shifted across her living room, casting long shadows that softened the space. I caught myself hesitating at the door, reluctant to leave the warmth, the laughter, the quiet connection we had carved out together. And as I walked back down the hallway, I realized that her invitation, simple as it had seemed, had done something subtle yet profound. She had drawn me closer, opened a small window into her world, and made the ordinary act of helping with a shelf feel like a turning point. I couldn't tell if she had intended it, but I knew, without question, that I was starting to care far more than I should have, and that the pull toward her was only growing stronger. It started with small conversations in the hallway, almost accidental, yet each one felt significant in a way I couldn't explain. I had stopped by her apartment to return a borrowed book when she caught me just as I was turning to leave. She leaned casually against her doorframe, a half-smile playing on her lips, and said, "You know, you're getting dangerously predictable, showing up at all the right times." Her teasing made me chuckle, a little embarrassed, a little thrilled. There was a rhythm to her voice, warm, confident, with just the faintest hint of amusement that made me forget how self-conscious I normally felt. And when she reached to adjust a picture frame near the door, our fingers brushed, light and fleeting, but the subtle spark lingered long after. I realized that our interactions had begun to feel like a careful dance. She asked about my week, and I found myself speaking more freely than I expected, sharing minor frustrations, quiet victories, small things I hadn't told anyone. She listened, genuinely, her gaze soft but unwavering, nodding as if absorbing every word. I noticed the way her eyes softened when I admitted to a small insecurity, and I felt my own defenses quietly start to drop. Then came her playful warning, one that I'll never forget. We were both kneeling on the hallway floor, arranging a pair of potted plants she was bringing in. Her hand brushed mine as she passed a small pot over, and she looked at me with an arch of her brow. "Careful, boy. I might just steal your firsts." Her tone was light, teasing, but it carried something heavier underneath, a suggestion of awareness, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of challenge. I froze, unsure how to respond. My mind scrambled for something witty or casual, but all I could manage was a nervous laugh. And yet, I noticed the warmth in her eyes, the subtle way she tilted her head, almost inviting me to step closer without saying a word. That moment, so fleeting, so simple, left a lasting impression. We lingered in the hallway longer than necessary, talking about inconsequential things. A movie she wanted to see, a book I had read, the stubborn cat that lived somewhere down the hall. But between the words, between the pauses, there was a current of connection I couldn't ignore. Each glance, each fleeting touch carried more weight than the actual conversation, making ordinary moments feel charged with possibility. As I walked back to my apartment, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. Her teasing had unsettled me in the best possible way, awakening an unfamiliar awareness, an attraction, yes, but also a fascination with the depth behind her playful exterior. I realized she had a way of drawing me in without ever forcing the pace, of creating a closeness that felt both exciting and safe at the same time. That night, I replayed the hallway scene over and over. Her smile, her voice, the brush of her fingers against mine, it all lingered, a quiet echo that I couldn't shake. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that something had shifted. A door had been opened, however slightly, and I couldn't help but want to step further inside. The first time we really spent hours together, it wasn't planned. A sudden downpour had trapped me in her apartment while I was dropping off a package. She offered me a cup of tea, and I accepted, grateful for the warmth, both of the room and of her presence. The rain drummed softly against the window, a constant, soothing rhythm that made everything inside feel like a world separate from the rest of the building. We settled on our couch with mugs in hand, and for a while, neither of us spoke much. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was comfortable. I noticed the subtle details I had begun to memorize. The way her fingers curled gently around her mug, the faint scent of vanilla in her hair, the soft lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled. I found myself staring longer than I intended, drawn to the warmth and confidence she exuded, but also to the quiet vulnerability beneath it. Eventually, conversation started again. She shared stories about her divorce, not with bitterness, but with honesty that made my chest ache a little. She talked about loneliness, about fear, about the strange weight of starting over in your 40s. I listened, rapt, my hand brushing against hers as she gestured while speaking. The contact was accidental, yet it carried an intimacy I hadn't felt before, a warmth that seemed to wrap itself around me. I felt a compulsion to be equally honest. I told her about my own doubts, my insecurities, the small mistakes I carried with me from one day to the next. There was no judgment in her expression, only understanding. She nodded, her gaze soft and unwavering, and at one point, her fingers rested lightly against my wrist, a grounding gesture that made my heartbeat spike in a way that was almost frightening in its intensity. Then came the small, unspoken gestures that lingered in the space between us. She leaned slightly closer to reach for the teapot. Her knee brushed mine as we shifted on the couch. I felt the heat of her hand near mine as she passed the mug, and for a fleeting second, it felt like the world had shrunk to the span of her touch. Each movement, each glance carried weight, building a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying in its subtlety. We laughed too, not loud, not exaggerated, but quiet, shared laughter that filled the room like a gentle pulse. At one point, I caught her looking at me with something deeper than amusement, something I couldn't quite name. Vulnerability, yes, but also recognition, the realization that there was something unspoken between us, a connection that neither of us could ignore. When the rain finally let up, I left her apartment reluctantly, carrying with me the warmth of our shared space and the memory of the quiet intimacy we had created. That evening, I realized how much I had already begun to care for her, how the simplicity of tea and conversation had revealed layers of connection I hadn't expected. And deep down, I knew that this slow, careful closeness, the accidental touches, the shared vulnerability, the lingering glances, was shaping something far more profound than either of us were ready to name. By now, our routines had begun to intertwine almost imperceptibly. I would see her in the hallway and instinctively pause, just a moment longer than necessary, hoping for a smile, a glance, a hint of acknowledgement that she was thinking of me too. She, in turn, seemed to move with a quiet awareness of my presence, subtle gestures, a brush of her fingers on the railing, a playful tilt of her head that made every encounter feel loaded with possibility. One evening, I found myself at her apartment again, ostensibly to drop off a borrowed DVD. She invited me in, naturally, without fanfare, and I stepped across the threshold into the warm glow of her living room. She was perched on the edge of the couch, a soft blanket draped across her lap, a book in her hands. The room smelled faintly of her perfume, mingled with the earthy scent of the rain-washed city outside. I felt a strange pull toward her, a magnetic quiet that made my usual awkwardness vanish. We sat together on the couch, side by side, but not touching at first. Yet every time our knees brushed, it felt electric, a spark so subtle I almost questioned whether I had imagined it. We spoke little, letting the quiet moments stretch, filled with the soft hum of the city beyond the window and the steady rhythm of our own breathing. I became acutely aware of her presence, the gentle warmth radiating from her, the soft tilt of her head as she read, the way her fingers occasionally traced the edge of the blanket, near enough for me to notice but not intrusive. Her eyes occasionally lifted to meet mine, and in those moments I caught glimpses of something deeper, an unspoken recognition of what had begun to form between us. She wasn't teasing this time. She was quiet, almost solemn, as if she too felt the tension, the pull, and the delicate thrill of what neither of us had yet named. My chest tightened, and I realized how desperately I wanted to close the distance without rushing it, to bridge the space between hesitation and surrender. The tension grew in subtle ways. A hand that lingered on a mug a little too long, a shared laugh that stretched just a beat too long, a brush of her hair from her shoulder. Each gesture, no matter how small, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. I felt both exhilarated and terrified, exhilarated by the closeness, terrified by the intensity of emotions I could not yet voice. Finally, she set the book aside and looked at me with an expression that was gentle yet penetrating. There was a quiet invitation in her gaze, a soft acknowledgement of the bond we had formed, the attraction that had crept in through laughter, touches, and shared vulnerability. And in that suspended moment, I realized we were both aware of it, the depth of feeling, the longing, the magnetic pull. Yet neither of us wanted to rush, afraid that words might shatter the delicate rhythm we had built. When I finally left her apartment that night, the air outside felt sharper, colder, but the memory of her warmth lingered like an ember. I walked down the hallway, replaying the small, electric moments, the touches, the glances, the silence that spoke more than words ever could. I understood then, with a quiet, thrilling certainty, that something profound was building between us, and that we were both acutely aware of it, even if neither dared to name it aloud. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glowing under the soft light of early evening. I found myself lingering in the hallway outside her door, unsure whether to knock or simply wait for her to appear. The small, careful rhythm of our shared encounters had become a comfort, but now I felt the urge for something more, a step forward, a moment that could finally put words to the tension that had been building between us for weeks. She opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me. The look in her eyes was soft, warm, and just faintly amused, a quiet acknowledgement of all the moments we had shared. The laughter, the accidental touches, the teasing warnings, and the long, intimate silences. I stepped inside, carrying with me a nervous excitement, and was immediately enveloped in the familiar warmth of her apartment. We sat on the couch together, as we had done before, but this time there was no hesitation. Our knees brushed, our shoulders touched, and instead of pulling away, we let ourselves sink into the closeness. She handed me a cup of tea, and our fingers met over the rim, lingering in a touch that felt deliberate yet natural. It was a simple gesture, but it carried all the weight of the unspoken feelings between us. Her hand slipped into mine almost instinctively. It was soft, warm, and fitting in a way that surprised me, as if it had been waiting there for weeks, waiting for me to finally notice. She leaned her cheek against my shoulder, and I felt her heartbeat steady and strong, a quiet rhythm that seemed to anchor me in a moment that was both fleeting and infinite. I held her hand gently, mindful of the warmth and trust it conveyed, realizing how far we had come from those first hallway glances. We didn't need words at first. The quiet of her apartment, the fading sunlight spilling through the curtains, and the soft hum of the city beyond a window filled the space between us. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every shared breath felt significant, a culmination of the small, careful steps we had taken together. And when we finally spoke, our voices were low, gentle, and filled with the familiarity of hard-earned connection. "I think I've been waiting for this," she said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. I squeezed her hand in response, feeling a mix of relief and exhilaration. "Me too," I admitted, my voice almost a whisper. Then, almost naturally, she rested her head fully against my shoulder, and I draped an arm around her, holding her close. The warmth of her body, the soft weight of her head, and the quiet steadiness of her presence made the world outside fade completely. We laughed softly at small, shared jokes, exchanged fleeting glances that said more than words ever could, and simply existed together in the intimacy of trust and care. As I walked back to my apartment later, the memory of that evening stayed with me. Her hand in mine, her cheek against my shoulder, the quiet, unspoken understanding that had grown between us. For the first time, I felt whole in a way I hadn't expected. She may have stolen my firsts, as she had teased, but she had given me something far more profound in return. A connection built on respect, trust, and a slow, enduring love that neither of us would ever forget.